didn't involve obscenity at all. It's what they define as pornography that subordinates women. What's the city's argument for this ordinance? Why do they need the McKinnon-Dworkin argument for this ordinance is that pornography affects thought, and thought affects behavior, and women end up in a subordinate position in society because of pornography that causes these results. So, sounds like a good idea, no? What's wrong with them? What's wrong with the ordinance? Put it this way. What's unconstitutional about the ordinance? The court decides it's unconstitutional. Why? Do you? It isn't narrowly tailored? Yeah, the court does emphasize that material that may well have redeeming literary, artistic, so on value. That's a different idea, though, isn't it? How's it different?
Because it's not necessarily a good viewpoint to think that within this object or whatever, but it's a viewpoint that the government isn't allowed to ban. The government isn't allowed to come in and say, these are the viewpoints that you're allowed to express, and it's only these ideas that we deem socially beneficial.
Right. The court said, it is true, that the ordinance was content-based, and then our knee-jerk reaction to that ought to be, therefore, strict scrutiny applies, therefore the government has to show compelling interest and narrow tailoring. But the court didn't do that. Having said it's content-based, it pointed out that the ordinance was viewpoint-based, and that's worse. That's a bigger blow to free speech than being content-based, because the government is weighing in on an idea that it prefers, as opposed to an idea that it disfavors. The government's getting involved in weighing what is and is not the correct viewpoint on a particular issue. So that what the court was concerned about here was that treating women in the approved way, that is, premised on equality, was okay, was lawful, no matter how sexually explicit it was, no matter how raw the sexual acts were in the pornography. That was just fine, as long as the treatment of women was portrayed in a way that was acceptable, that is, they were viewed as equal partners. While speech that treats women in the disapproved way by the law as submissive or enjoying humiliation was unlawful and prohibited, no matter how significant its literary artistic qualities might be. Pointing out that books like James Joyce's Ulysses, Homer's Iliad, and so on, did treat women as submissive and in humiliating ways, and yet you can't say that they ought to be prohibited consistent with our First Amendment. The court says engaging in this kind of viewpoint discrimination is thought control, violating the First Amendment principle that we all have the right to express our opinions on whatever issues are of the day, including the Brandenburg case. The court cites Brandenburg. This is even speech that the government finds wrong or hateful. The Ku Klux Klan can speak, Brandenburg. Communists can speak, like the march into Skokie, Illinois, that the court refers to. That was its own decision. The American Nazis that marched into the Jewish community in Skokie with the blessing of the Court of Appeal. And those factors emphasize the unconstitutionality of this law. The city argues, well, but this speech, this pornography stuff, we're not talking political speech here, not core speech. This is low-value speech that doesn't deserve full First Amendment protection. And the court responds, interestingly, there, that it isn't. We take the premises of this legislation as true. The premise being this speech causes results, affects thoughts, and affects behavior. You can't call that kind of speech low value. It's powerful. You may not agree with it, but you can't say that it's not important in some way. And even if you could say this is low value speech, as the court has never been consistent throughout all of its First Amendment jurisprudence, as the court sometimes indicates, non-political speech may be subject to less protection, less constitutional value than core political speech. But even if you accept it, that there may be some kinds of speech that are low value, the viewpoint discrimination here ruins it for the city. For example, the court refers to the Pacifica decision that we'll consider in a little while. That's the one that gave birth to the FCC's regulation of indecency on broadcast, the case that's now in the Supreme Court. And the court in Pacifica decided that indecent speech on the airwaves during times when children may be in the audience can be suppressed and punished by the FCC. And that was part of the Indianapolis argument. Well, look, if the government can suppress indecent speech, surely it can suppress this low-value pornography. The court had said in Pacifica that the indecent speech lay at the periphery of First Amendment protection. Well, Indianapolis says that's true here, too. The court's response to that is the viewpoint discrimination point. The court in Pacifica would never have okayed regulation of scatological descriptions of Republicans, but not of Democrats. Is there a way around the problem here? Kelly? Yeah, well, the court doesn't say, well, this speech doesn't cause any harm, and therefore it's constitutional. The court accepts that it does cause harm. and says that it is unconstitutional for the separate reason that the government is exercising viewpoint discrimination here. Even worse than targeting content, the government says, on this issue, this is government approved, this idea is government approved, but this idea is condemned by government. Viewpoint discrimination is worse than targeting particular content. There isn't a viewpoint?
It's not a viewpoint to say, you're saying the argument is correct, is that it does affect behavior. And behavior is not like
Yes, I see your point, but looking at the speech, which is the question, is this kind of speech protected or unprotected? And the government says speech that meets our viewpoint, treating women as equals, even though it's sexually explicit, is fine, but speech that we don't like, we disapprove, speech that treats women as subordinate, is illegal, even if it has significant literary and artistic value. That kind of viewpoint discrimination inherent in the speech is what's wrong with this law, regardless of, the speech on either side of that viewpoint divide can cause thought and can cause behavior. Maybe, I guess Catherine McKinnon would say it's better behavior if women are treated as equals. And that's a societally desirable thing, I take it. But regulating speech in the service of regulating that kind of behavior runs into, the court quotes it from the Jehovah's Witnesses case, from the flag salute case. If there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it's that no official, higher petty, blah, blah, shall prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, so on. Right out of the Barnett case, the Jehovah's Witnesses case. We have an absolute right to propagate opinions that the government finds wrong or even hateful. Tough. Words matter, though, I guess. And the fact that speech is powerful and carries the power to inflict actual harm does not mean that the government is entitled to suppress it. Any rationale we could imagine in support of this ordinance could not be limited to sex discrimination. Slippery slope. That if the government can get away with treating this kind of speech as sex discrimination. See, the result of the law would be that anybody who was injured, even at work in an employment discrimination context, anybody who was injured and could trace the cause of that back to the pornography would be entitled to sue the publisher of the books, the magazines, the videos, whatever the pornography was. And if that's true, then lots of things that the government would like to outlaw, they could outlaw the expression of opinions that it disfavors, as long as it could show some cause and effect relationship. Dangerous to free speech. American booksellers, it was the viewpoint discrimination thing, that's the real takeaway there. And unless you've got something more about that, we can go to the violent video games case, which is something I'm real curious about where you are on that. Are there any of you who have not played a violent video game? A few, really, but the great majority. The great majority. Huh? Well, then, who would like to tell me? Because I'm such an innocent about these things. I've not played a violent video game, or any video game, ever. I wouldn't know what to do. I don't know whether you need specialized equipment or whether I could do. Driving has nothing to do with video games?
Well, I thought it did. I never could drive straight in these videos. I get so frustrated, and then I'm decent driver.
Well, what's it like to play a violent video game anyway? Let's get it all out here.
So there's games like Grand Theft Auto where you can walk around with a shotgun, you start unloading on random people on the street, picking up prostitutes, you can get a tank, blow shit up. There's a lot of fun things you can do, but it has a value. It teaches you how to be task-oriented. It teaches you
A task-oriented. So
like you get this mission done before sunrise. So it's like, okay, I know in the game I have 20 minutes. I can go pick up a shotgun, go get some officers, shoot something up, and get back to base. So it teaches children good values.
Do you enjoy that thing?
Absolutely.
You know, it's fun to do this, huh?
Yeah.
To kill people and.
Well, not real people.
Well, they look like real people, don't they?
No, they don't.
No.
They don't beat out like real people. They don't scream like real people. That's how it goes.
John?
I think violent video games can do like one of two things. Two person, you can be more aggressive, more physical, or it can like let out your anger and like don't have this anger in real life. Or like in Mark's situation, it doesn't really affect you because Mark's not trying to kill people and he's not angry at you, so he just like does it for fun.
People who will become more aggressive and violent.
But I don't think you can prove who you are like more than others.
Why couldn't you prove it? I mean, you get some kid who's gone out and walked into a schoolroom and gunned down half the kids there, and it's entirely provable that he has spent his entire adolescence watching Mortal Kombat. Or,
That's one of 100 kids, the other 99 kids.
but he's the one who did the shooting.
Yes, more than 99 kids were going to shoot and they played video games.
Well, it's not 100% effective in converting them all into murderers, but it affected the one who did it.
What if the 99 kids learn self-defense from video games and just aren't the ones doing it?
Sam's an expert on violent video games.
Not really, but I feel like the thing with playing video games is not different than playing rap music or Martin Scorsese films for causing other people to go and shoot other people. You can't say that. These people are easily affected by some materials. So you can't ban all materials. So somebody sees fan being like, oh wow, that's this could be such a money rate and go kill them deer.
Yeah, but we're talking Mortal Kombat and Grand Theft Auto. No, I want to know how has playing violent video games affected you?
Greatly.
Affected you? Greatly?
Not me. I didn't like video games. I was going to say, I don't know if there's a wrestling or one or two like football, but there was a study they talked about that said it doesn't affect people to make them more violent unless they were already prone to be violent. It actually makes them more fearful. So that's what I was thinking.
Well, the effects don't need to be uniform, do they? I mean, that it always causes everyone to behave in the same way in order for government to have some legitimate role to play in containing the adverse effects. Does everybody agree there's some adverse effect to playing video games? Yeah, really? I'm shocked to hear that. Mark?
Well, I mean, it all depends on video games. If you're playing a lot of Star Wars, there's no way you have access to a lightsaber. You cut people with a lightsaber. It doesn't exist. I also feel like this argument has been used forever. Like people, it was like the 50s, they wouldn't film Elvis below the hips and that would make girls too prone to like sex. I mean, this is the same argument that they use over and over again. And it's, I mean, it's time tested. Yes, it's enough to break through people, make them not want to watch all this video games. But I still don't feel substantial enough to make kids want to go and just, blow shit up or shoot something up. In the case that you were talking about, with one kid who decides to shoot at school, I mean, realistically, video games, the kid's definitely unstable. He's going to find some way to be destructive. Whether it's, shooting something up, doing drugs, or, some self-infliction. That's more of a case-by-case basis than the entire macro scheme of video games itself.
Mm-hmm.
I agree, and yet I don't know. If you look at the cases, there was one where some teenagers got drunk and high and got in a car and actually later down really grand theft auto. They were playing a game under the influence. Like in that situation, I don't know if it's necessarily being prone to violence, because that was just like being outside, using drugs or whatnot. Maybe do that and it looks like a more prone to violence type of thing. So I think it's definitely a case of this thing. So if there's something like that happening, that's problematic.
Mm-hmm. Also?
Don't we have to use like the same kind of government that was free police government, which are rating and being part of the verbal marriage?
Say that again? The same standard that the court used? In what case?
And like these cases such as like New York Times versus Penal Papers, doesn't like ratings have to show that people have to show that it's great and you harm so it's very
Well, that standard from the Pentagon Papers is what the government has to meet in order to get a prior restraint saying that you can't say that. With the video game situation, what the state of California did was enact a law that made it illegal with a civil penalty to sell violent video games. We'll get to what they exactly did in a minute, to minors. Tina?
Case wasn't called banning video games, though. It was to not sell them to kids. And Scalia does say that video games are a vehicle for ideas, just like films and books. But then again, we don't let kids see R-rated movies. So there, maybe there's a case to be made for even out of the hands of children.
Well, so movies have these ratings, so do video games, I understand, but they're not government. The ratings are not government enforced. That is, the theaters don't get in legal trouble by letting a kid into an R-rated movie. Ariel?
No, I mean, I agree that it's up to the discretion of the person from the video game, but I think it's interesting that the movie did it and film or music, because psychologically, like, it's you who is shooting or whatever. You're not watching someone shoot, like, your character is acting all those things.
Yeah. What difference does that make?
Because it's like, you get to feel, like, the power, however effective it psychologically is that you will be like, the adrenaline rush from shooting something, whereas, like, if you're watching someone else do it in a movie, it probably doesn't affect you so much.
Yeah, but don't you identify in movies with characters? And isn't that one of the things that makes movies so engrossing, is that you can identify with a character?
Yeah, but it's not a character that, like, I designed up to be able to look like.
When Mortal Kombat first came out, it was almost 20 years ago, actually. It had gone from arcade games to you could have it right there at home. You remember the day? No, you don't. It was 19 years ago. When they announced that Mortal Kombat was going to be available for sale, they expected to sell at least 2 million copies. God knows how many more than that they've done now. With its remarkably realistic carnage. It came in 2 versions, with or without extreme violence. Both versions gave the victor a fatality move, a much-cherished chance to kill. The gorier program also provided the thrill of humiliating the loser by barehandedly ripping out his still-beating heart, tearing off his life-like head, and triumphantly holding it aloft. It's the best. It's the best, said Wilson Hung, 16, an 11th grader. Among his favorite moves was knocking an enemy off the ledge and watching him become impaled on a sharpened spike. The most gratifying moment came when he could electrocute a victim. What kind of lessons are we teaching our children? Well, California enacted this law in 2005, believing that violent video games affected kids in undesirable ways. And the law made it illegal to sell a game to somebody that a reasonable person would find appeals to a deviant or morbid interest of minors, and that is patently offensive to community standards for minors, and lacks serious literary and artistic value for minors. What does this remind you of? It's the obscenity test dressed up in slightly different clothes and short pants for minors. It's basically the same 3 tests for minors tacked onto each of them, and appeals to a deviant or morbid interest. I take it as different from sexual arousal.